The crucial importance of enforcing the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the key to world peace and prosperity. This is part one. Hello, my name is Edward Solino. Coming out of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations, listing the various human rights to be respected and defended, was adopted and proclaimed by the United Nations on December 10, 1948. All members of the UN have signed it and pledged to promote and uphold it. Unfortunately, even tragically and scandalously, the great majority of the member states of the United Nations not only do not respect and uphold the human rights they have pledged to defend, they actually purposely violate human rights as a matter of government policy. Yet, the United Nations has mostly acquiesced, a terrible mistake. In fact, it's passively accepting the violation of human rights without outrage, without condemnation, and without imposing severe sanctions amounts to a cynical, tacit validation of human rights violations, even to diminishing and discrediting the moral imperative of human rights. At a minimum, violating member nations should have their voting rights revoked, and persistent violators should face expulsion from the United Nations. What is the point of having the Universal Declaration of Human Rights if the United Nations does not actively enforce it? By not strictly enforcing its Human Rights Charter and publicly shaming its violators, the UN has severely stained its own reputation and credibility. It is no wonder that human rights violations such as of freedom of speech and of women's equal rights are so widespread around the world. Meanwhile, religious discrimination is not only widespread, harming countless individuals, it is the cause of much terrorism and even of conflicts between nations. If we want a world which seriously respects and upholds human rights violations must be loudly publicized and condemned, and nation violators must be expelled from the United Nations. Otherwise, human rights will continue not to be taken seriously by many nations, and outrageous violations will never end. The importance of having human rights respected worldwide cannot be overstated. World peace depends on it, not only justice and the proper treatment of individual human beings. Logically, the first step towards having human rights universally respected is to have every citizen of the world become knowledgeable of the Universal Declaration, which is not at all the case today, not by a long shot. When all citizens of the world are fully aware of the Universal Declaration, it will be difficult for governments to violate human rights, since there will be a strong expectation amongst populations that human rights will be defended by their governments. Educating the citizens of the world on the existence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an absolute prerequisite for having human rights upheld worldwide. Upon the proclamation and adoption of the Universal Declaration back in 1948, the United Nations called on its members to publicize the text of the Universal Declaration, but to no avail. Worse, for many governments, human rights are a cynical joke. For many governments, human rights are dismissed, not even given lip service. It behooves those who truly believe in human rights and want a world fully respectful of human rights to find a way to push the United Nations to finally enforce its Human Rights Charter without compromise. The Universal Declaration itself emphasizes the importance of publicizing the Declaration in order for human rights to be respected worldwide. It states in Article 26 that everyone has the right to education and that, I quote, "Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups." End quote. Scandalously, the United Nations and its members have essentially ignored Article 26, and practically no one is aware of this scandalous failure. The consequences have been and continue to be tragic. The innumerable, horrifying human rights violations throughout history, up to the present day, are an indictment of our political and diplomatic efforts to free the world from human rights violations. A drastic, new approach is needed, an approach which confronts the problem directly and honestly, putting aside denial and political correctness. If we are serious about human rights, if we are seriously committed to finally end the tragedy of horrific widespread human rights violations around the world, then, for the good of humanity, we have to be really honest with ourselves and with others about some very hard, uncomfortable truths, which may deeply disturb, upset, and even offend many people, since those hard truths contradict deeply held religious beliefs of many people, beliefs they have had since childhood and with which they identify. But telling the hard truth about the roots of human rights violations is the only way to get rid of human rights abuses. Denial and political correctness, not wanting to offend people's deeply held religious beliefs, which are a big part of the problem, all that prevents solutions from being found and implemented. Regarding religious discrimination, it is very difficult to eradicate because it is most often the consequence of commands to discriminate by a religion's holy book to its followers. That explains why religious discrimination is held by believers to be justified and moral, even if it violates the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The reasoning is that the religion's holy book is the word of its God, and is therefore superior in moral and legal value than any law enacted by human beings. In many cases, this leads not only to religious discrimination, but also to religious violence, religious censorship, and the violation of women's equal rights. So, the problem comes down to the question of determining which laws have primacy: laws enacted by human beings to protect human rights, or laws contained in a religion's holy book which violate human rights. Clearly, for human rights to be universally respected, upheld, and defended, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights must be viewed worldwide without exceptions as having primacy over other laws, whether enacted by nations or whether contained in religious holy books. To overcome objections of monotheistic believers that God's word must have primacy, one could rebut that there may well be many errors of transcription in the Bible and the Quran, so that any violations of human rights mandated in those holy books are the result of mistaken transcription. After all, those holy books were written by human beings, and human beings do make mistakes. The idea being that the God of the Bible and the Quran cannot possibly be in favor of human rights violations. What type of God would that be? A God who wants human rights to be violated? Considering all the abhorrent violations of human rights deriving from religious discrimination throughout history, the countless religious wars, the never-ending Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religious violence, religious censorship, the Holocaust, the burning of heretics at the stake, Islamic terrorism, the beheadings of infidels, how can anyone uphold the primacy of the commands of the Bible and the Quran over the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? On the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no one can reasonably deny that the conflict is not essentially about land, as most diplomats mistakenly insist. Rather, it is essentially about religious discrimination. In fact, would there be a conflict if the Israelis were Muslim, or if the Palestinians were Jewish, or if both the Israelis and Palestinians were all atheists? Of course not. That's why all the land for peace negotiations have failed. It is high time for everyone to recognize and admit the truth, however delicate that truth may be, since it implicates two competing discriminatory religions, Judaism and Islam, which both sides are emotionally attached to and believe in. In the Old Testament, God only loves the Jews, the Israelites, and promises them the land of Israel in exclusivity, in exchange for all males being circumcised. Whereas in the Quran, Allah only loves Islam and Muslims, and openly detests the Jews. For the conflict to end and full reconciliation and lasting peace to be reached, both sides will have to decide that human rights have primacy over their respective religions. This is the end of part 1. Thanks for your attention.